The Spice Wars, when flavor was worth more than guldens, they belonged to Venetian and Middle Eastern traders. But monopolies rarely last forever because extraordinary profits tend to attract competitors. And in the early 17th century, a new challenger arrived in the Indian Ocean, the Dutch Republic. At the time, the Netherlands was engaged in a bitter struggle for independence from Spain. Dutch merchants and financiers were already some of the most active traders in Europe, and they quickly recognized the opportunity created by Portugal's spice monopoly. If they could break Portuguese control of the trade routes, the profits could reshape their entire economy. But the Dutch approach introduced something new into global commerce, something far more organized and far more powerful than individual merchant expeditions. In 1602, the Dutch government approved the creation of a company that would become one of the most influential economic institutions in history, the Verenigde Compagnie. Better known as the Dutch East India Company, the VOC was not an ordinary trading company. It was something closer to a corporate state. Investors across the Netherlands pooled their capital into a single organization that received extraordinary powers from the Dutch government. The company could build forts, maintain armies, negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, and wage war when necessary. It could also issue shares that were traded in Amsterdam, creating one of the earliest stock markets in Europe. In modern terms, the VOC was a multinational corporation with military authority, and its primary mission was simple: break the Portuguese monopoly and control the spice trade. The Dutch soon discovered that the most valuable spices came from a remote chain of islands known as the Maluku Islands, often called the Spice Islands. These islands were the only place on Earth where nutmeg and cloves grew naturally. Control those islands and you controlled the supply. Control the supply and you controlled the price, but controlling them would require more than trade agreements, because the spice trade had become too valuable for peaceful competition alone. And soon, the fight for flavor would become something much darker. The Spice Wars had begun. The Banda Islands, ground zero of the Spice Wars Islands at the center of this struggle, were small, remote, and almost invisible on most maps of the early 17th century. But economically, they were among the most valuable pieces of land on Earth. The Banda Islands, a tiny archipelago in the eastern Indonesian seas, surrounded by coral reefs and volcanic hills. The islands were home to only a few thousand inhabitants, most of them skilled farmers who cultivated a tree that grew almost nowhere else in the world, nutmeg. At the time, nutmeg was not merely a cooking ingredient. Europeans believed it had medicinal properties that could protect against illness, improve digestion, and even ward off the plague. Whether those beliefs were accurate mattered less than the fact that buyers across Europe were willing to pay extraordinary prices for it. And the Banda Islands controlled nearly the entire global supply. For centuries, the islanders had traded nutmeg with Asian merchants who sailed through the region. Arab traders, Indian merchants, and Chinese sailors all participated in the exchange. The system was relatively flexible. Local producers sold their harvest to whoever offered the best price. Then the Europeans arrived first. The Portuguese attempted to insert themselves into the trade network, but their control remained limited. The Dutch, however, had a different strategy. The Dutch East India Company did not simply want access to nutmeg. It wanted monopoly. From the company's perspective, the logic was brutally straightforward. If the VOC controlled the only source of nutmeg in the world, it could dictate prices across Europe. Supply could be restricted, shipments controlled, and profits maintained at extraordinary levels. But achieving that monopoly required something the islanders had no reason to accept: exclusive trade agreements. The Dutch demanded that the Banda Islanders sell nutmeg only to the VOC. No trade with English merchants, no trade with Asian traders. Only Dutch ships would carry the spice to global markets. The islanders resisted. For generations, they had sold their crops freely. The arrival of European corporations attempting to dictate prices and trade partners threatened their independence and their livelihoods. So they continued trading with whoever would buy their nutmeg, including the English. From a local perspective, this was simply normal commerce. From the Dutch East India Company's perspective, it was sabotage because every sack of nutmeg sold to a competitor weakened the monopoly the company was trying to build. The VOC leadership decided to enforce its control the only way it believed would work: force. The Banda Massacre. When commerce became conquest in 1621, the Governor-General of the Dutch East India Company, Jan Pieterszoon Koon, launched a military campaign against the Banda Islands. Cone was a hardline advocate of the monopoly strategy. In his view, the spice trade was too valuable to allow any competition. His fleet arrived with soldiers, ships, and orders to secure total control. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in the history of early global trade. Dutch forces attacked the Banda Islands and systematically crushed resistance. Villages were destroyed. Leaders were executed. Thousands of island inhabitants were killed or displaced. Historical estimates vary, but the scale of the devastation was enormous relative to the small population of the islands within a short period. Most of the original inhabitants of the Banda Islands had either been killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. The Dutch then repopulated the islands with plantation workers and settlers who would operate under strict company control. Nutmeg cultivation continued, but now it did so inside a carefully managed colonial system designed to maximize profit for the VOC. The result was exactly what the company wanted. Monopoly. With competing traders eliminated and the local population subdued. The Dutch East India Company controlled the global supply of nutmeg. Shipments could be limited to maintain high prices in European markets, and those prices were astonishing. Nutmeg purchased cheaply in Southeast Asia could sell for several 100% profit once it reached Europe. Investors in the Dutch Republic saw enormous returns. Amsterdam's financial markets thrived as spice cargoes arrived in port, but the Banda massacre also revealed something deeper about the emerging global economy. Trade alone did not create the system. Violence often enforced it. When the profits from a commodity become large enough, commercial competition can quickly escalate into political conflict. And the spice trade was now valuable enough to reshape international rivalries. The Anglo-Dutch Wars, when spices sparked global conflict. Dutch were not the only Europeans pursuing those profits. England had also entered the spice trade through its own corporate venture, the English East India Company. Like the VOC, it was backed by investors and royal authority. English merchants and ships operated across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Inevitably, the two powers collided. Competition between the Dutch and English companies soon spilled into broader geopolitical tensions between their governments. The mid-17th century saw a series of conflicts now known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. These wars were fought across multiple theaters, European waters, the Atlantic, and colonial outposts around the world. At first glance, the battles appeared to revolve around naval supremacy. But beneath the surface lay economic rivalry. Both nations understood that global trade routes represented enormous wealth. Whoever controlled the flow of commodities, spices, textiles, sugar, and later tea would gain financial power that extended far beyond the battlefield. One small island captured the strange economics of this rivalry perfectly. Run Island was part of the Banda archipelago and one of the few places where nutmeg trees grew naturally. During the early phases of the spice conflicts, the English managed to establish a foothold there, creating a rare breach in the Dutch monopoly. For the Dutch East India Company, this was unacceptable. As long as the English controlled even one nutmeg island, the monopoly remained incomplete. Years of skirmishes and negotiations followed. Finally, in 1667, the conflict produced a settlement known as the Treaty of Breda. The agreement resolved several territorial disputes between England and the Dutch Republic. Among its provisions was a remarkable exchange. The Dutch secured permanent control over Run Island and the nutmeg trade. The English kept control of another territory. They had recently seized a small trading outpost on the North American coast called New Amsterdam. Today, we know that place by a different name, Manhattan. In the 17th century, the economic logic behind the exchange made perfect sense. Nutmeg was one of the most valuable commodities in global trade. A single spice island promised steady profits from European markets. New Amsterdam, by contrast, was a modest colonial settlement with uncertain prospects. Financial history is full of these moments, decisions that seem perfectly rational within the economic context of their time, but appear astonishing in hindsight. At the height of the spice trade, controlling flavor meant controlling fortune. The pattern that still shapes our world. Spice wars reveal something fundamental about the development of the global financial system. Markets alone rarely determine outcomes when the stakes become large enough. When a commodity offers extraordinary profits, competition intensifies. Governments intervene. Corporations seek monopolies. Naval fleets enforced trade rules across oceans. The early global economy was not simply built by merchants exchanging goods. It was built by states and corporations fighting to control supply chains, and the pattern still appears today. Modern economies revolve around different commodities: oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, semiconductor manufacturing. But the underlying dynamic remains familiar: control the supply, control the price, control the power. The spice wars were one of the first global examples of this pattern. European powers traveled halfway around the world to secure control over small islands because those islands produced something scarce, valuable, and difficult to replace. Flavor became fortune, and fortune became conflict. The early architects of global trade understood a lesson that remains relevant centuries later. Markets may begin with commerce, but when profits grow large enough, they're often defended with cannons. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but if you follow the money and the resources behind it, the patterns become difficult to ignore. If this gave you a new perspective on how finance shapes history, hit subscribe to Finber's Stories, where money meets history. We'll show you the connections that change the world.